Hey listeners, welcome to UniversiTV, and today we're going to be talking about the Netflix original 13 Reasons Why.
Listeners, welcome to your tape.
Engage.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
I am the one who knocks.
Hi guys, today before we get started, we just wanted to check in with you and let you know that we're going to be talking about some of the things that happen in the television show 13 Reasons Why. Some of them include sexual assault, rape, and suicide. These potentially could be triggering for some people, so we just want to give you a heads up and ask you to listen with caution. I'm Jessica Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen.
And today we're going to be talking about 13 Reasons Why. Grown. Seriously, I don't think I'm going to be able to get through this without just...
If it makes you feel any better, the internet agrees with you.
Yes. Well, and that's part
half the internet.
Half the internet.
Right.
Part of the thing that's going on here, there's been a ton of controversy about this particular show, and we're actually kind of late to the party in terms of how much the show's been discussed on social media. I think I had friends posting information about it all week, and about how frustrated they were with the show. Did you guys have the same experience?
Well, so I had a lot of people from work who they post about on social media like, oh, had to binge it, got into it. I have to know what happens. And then you see a lot of memes about it. And so I was like, okay, I don't know what the show's about. And then we decided to watch it for this show. And looking back on all those things, I had very much a Jessica reaction of grown.
Yeah, my social media blew up with people who were boycotting it and telling other people not to watch it. So that seems to be have been my experience, which is why I was a little nervous watching the show for the podcast, because I was like, oh no, I'm going to engage in the thing people are telling me not to engage with. But generally speaking, people were pretty vehemently against even engaging with the material at all.
Well, and that's a pretty big concern for me right now, too, because I feel like we decided as a group, for those who are listening, 13 Reasons Why, if you haven't seen the show, is a story about high school. And when Clay Baker arrives home from school to find a box full of tapes from a girl who has recently committed suicide, he's horrified. It turns out that he also not the only one who has listened to the tapes. The girl, Hannah Baker, recorded a tape for each person she feels contributed in some way to her decision to kill herself. As Clay listens to the tapes excruciatingly slowly, he becomes more and more involved with the other students on the tapes. So this is a summary for the show. And it's caused a lot of controversy because of the stuff that it decided to depict, and people are having a lot of negative reactions to it. And I felt really awkward watching it for the purpose of discussing it for this podcast. But I also felt like it was a really interesting step in television history. High school has always been something that's been really big, that has... that we keep going back to that place over and over again. We love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Veronica Mars, the OC, right? This is a whole bunch of different shows that have popped up and been part of popular culture. And this seems to be the newest iteration of the experience of high school right now in 2017. So...
Well, one of my favorite shows growing up, and while I was in high school, and I will begrudgingly admit after I got out of high school, was Degrassi.
Oh my gosh.
Which I think a lot of people have watched either guiltily without telling anybody or openly and telling everybody, because I think those are the two options when you watch Degrassi.
Shout out to Drake if you're listening.
You mean Paraplegic Jimmy? That's definitely him in the show.
He left that past behind.
Yeah, I'm
Ashley.
sure he did. And I mean, that show is really melodramatic, right? It's depicting high school. It's depicting Canadian high school on top of everything else. And it's deeply melodramatic. And I just remember because, the things that were happening to people on this show, right? People were getting abortions, people were getting raped, people were getting Islamophobia, people were, there was a school shooting.
Is that a verb?
It is now.
Or catching. Apparently it's catching.
Yeah. And so I think for me personally, I watched that show and I was like, oh, this is extreme. This is, I've not been in these situations. And so, but at the same time, it was entertaining television, and it tried to engage with hardcore material that that other shows that I was watching at the time, like The Vampire Diaries, which is also high school, those things were not trying to address high school as a real experience. And so that's what I appreciated about that depiction.
Well, and a lot of them are PSAs, right? Like that's essentially the function that they all serve is like, hey, we're going to try and instruct the upcoming generation about the things that can be scary. I mean, one of my favorite things about Buffy, and I know I talk about this a lot, but the idea that, in those episodes, people who smoke die or are evil. Like those are the two options. If you smoke a cigarette at some point, you die or you become evil. And so that's part of what these high school shows are supposed to do. Does this fit into that category?
Well, I think that's the intent, right? That 13 Reasons Why, when you listen to Selena Gomez, the executive producer, and the other producers of the show, they're like, we really wanted to send a message about, how you should interact with other people and how you should treat other people. And it kind of harkens back, I think, a little bit to Glee. If we kind of on the other spectrum, it's comedy, right? It's a musical comedy. But Glee definitely has always been, for me, a PSA. That it's like, I'll always remember the episode where Quinn gets in a car accident. And that's like the end of season 3. And she comes back season 4 in a wheelchair. And she's talking to everyone. And she says, and that's why I'll never text and drive again. And I just said, okay, cool. After school special, now go sing a song from Journey. And I can't really think of a high school show that hasn't really had that message of like, treat each other well. You're impressionable 16-year-olds. And I think 13 Reasons Why tries to do that.
Right. Yeah, I think it takes on that mantle in a lot of ways. The purpose of the story is like, be nice to other people. I mean, I think that's essentially the theme of the show.
You never know how what you say and do will affect another person.
Right. And so you need to be really careful. Be kind, right? And they just take it to such an extreme, though. It's so extreme in the way that they decide to handle everything that happens.
Right. I mean, everything in the show is extreme. And I'll preface now, I hate this show. I hate it with a fiery passion. I want to give it my 13 tapes about why I hate it. And part of that reason is that it's all about externalizing what she does with committing suicide. It's, you're the reasons I did this. And they're basically saying, hey, other people's choices, what they choose to do is your fault. And I think that makes it pretty problematic. And there's a difference, I think, right? Like they even bring it up in the show, like one person did this horrible thing to her and another person published a poem, right? And there's varying levels, but it always externalizes that.
So before, I think we all hated it. Just to be upfront with our listeners here, we all hated the show, and one of the experiences we share is we kept waiting to like shred this thing. We were waiting to record this episode for you guys, and we were trying to hold all of this in just so we could let it out. But we did want to try real fast to see if there are things we could find about the show that we liked before we recommend, since Scott started us off with our shredding of this particular show. So does anybody have something that they liked?
Okay, so it's pretty complicated, but I do think the show does a couple of things that are interesting. One thing I think is worth mentioning is that most high school television shows like function on a spectrum, right? There's realistic high school shows where the dialogue and the conversations happen, and they're very natural. And they're not very witty or very bright because they're in high school and they're just people walking around talking to each other. I think 13 Reasons Why fits into this category. On the other side of the spectrum, you have stuff like Dawson's Creek or Veronica Mars, where the dialogue is really punchy and really witty. It's dealing with a lot of really interesting stuff, but 13 Reasons Why is one of those shows where the dialogue consistently suffers. And see, I'm already talking about something I don't like about the show as I'm trying to conjure up something that I actually do like about it. But the one thing that I would say is I actually thought that the direction in the show was not half bad. The way the colors are saturated, they had a couple of different directors on the show who were really careful. And I thought that those elements, just the production elements, were not bad. And I probably wouldn't age like, when I go back and watch episodes of Buffy and they're wearing the 90s clothes and the camera work is really bad, I'm sitting there going like, I can actually see the microphone in the shot, right? Like, so I thought that at least this show had some good production quality to it. And I thought that was worth mentioning. And that's it.
Okay. So I would like to piggyback off of that. And the one thing I want to say I like about the show, and I don't think I can say it about the show because the content is so horrible, but the performances from the young cast for me were really fascinating because this is a young cast, relatively unknown. I think people recognize Clay a little bit from a stint he did on Grey's Anatomy as someone's son. And so, yeah, he plays Kate Walsh's son briefly in Grey's Anatomy when he's super young. And so people thought there's a fan theory out there about how this is an extension of Grey's Anatomy. I'm going to walk away from that. But I think the performances were very, very well done, especially from such a young cast, and especially with the content they had to deal with. And I think part of what makes me so critical of this particular show is that the performances were very good, which meant that every episode was an immersive experience for me. They always drew me in with their performances that I had to engage with the content even when I didn't want to because of how bad it was.
Right.
So if I really have to strain, which I am going to find something, and while I think it's problematic, and I'll discuss this later, it does draw you in.
Right.
It does draw you into the mystery, and you are curious about what's going to happen next and how people were involved, and when Clay is going to get to his tape and what was his involvement. And it really does a good job of drawing you in that regard. And I'll backpack off. I think the editing and the sound design were passable, good even.
Right, for a high school television show, right? Like when you're considering what production values are typically on those shows, I think this is in a different class. Yeah.
I will say that the cast of 16 and 17-year-old kids, half of them having tattoos. I mean, maybe your makeup department could have done something about that.
Suspension of disbelief gone.
Yeah, no, they were all tattooed. Like, I was so confused. I was like, are they getting permission for, who is going with them? Is this a team thing? So, yeah, I was very confused about that. So.
Okay, so are you ready to hate on this thing?
I've been counting down the days.
All right, buckle up, listeners, because we're about to do this for real.
There are so many things about the show I don't even know where to start. I think for me one of the biggest problems that I had with this show was actually in the depiction of the parents. So to begin with, part of what they seem to be trying to do, Hannah commits suicide at the end of the show, right? And we get images of her parents dealing with that situation after she's died, right? And we also get all of their kind of before moments, right? Where they're happy and excited and kind to their daughter, and they're having all of these experiences with their daughter, and she's going off to do school dances, and they're being supportive and sweet and kind to her, right? And I think at some point it's supposed to be kind of, it was one of the ways in which they were trying to make Hannah seem a little bit selfish in the ways that she decided to depict this. I think it just made the parents look oblivious. I think it backfired. I don't think it did what they were intending it to do, because they didn't look cruel to me. Hannah didn't end up looking cruel to me. It just looked like her parents were not clued in. And it was the same with all of the parents in the show. And so I wasn't sure, but that's one of the things I hated the most.
Right. Well, I think I will say this about Hannah's parents. I think it's important that they don't know that they are oblivious. Right? Because they talk about, if the purpose of the show is saying, pay attention to your friends, pay attention to what you do, pay attention to your kids, that's important for that to happen. But every parent in the show is laissez-faire and doesn't pay attention. And I think it's really exacerbated and really demonstrated well in Clay's parents, who they're like, I don't know, if my kid got caught with weed, planted or not, and if they were going out, I wouldn't let them continue to go out. they don't have a rein on him, and I get it. They think, oh, he's going through some stuff, but he doesn't even admit to knowing Hannah until more than halfway through the show. So what are they doing?
Well, and it is part of the tropes of parenting in these kinds of shows, right? Like in high school dramas, the parents are absent because you can't have high school drama without absent parents. Theoretically, right? If your parents are watching you and surveilling you all the time, you don't get to have... But it was one of those contrivances that was set up throughout the entire show where, Clay gets a hold of these tapes, he's listening to them so slowly, and he's not communicating with his parents. Like, he's just not telling them. And he keeps saying things like cryptically to his mom and dad where he's like, I'll tell you about it later. And it's like, why? Why are we waiting for this to happen? Like, what, and I think that there's some kind of moral about, parents being disconnected and not being able to get that kind of information out of their kids and not being able to have honest conversations. Right. I think that that's the work that this show is trying to do. But I just thought it was so tragic the way that that Hannah's parents specifically are portrayed throughout these episodes. Because what they did were they turned them into these caricatures so that they could have this big moment at the end where they find her, right? That's the whole reason why we have this set up the way that we do. And it just felt really disingenuous to me, and I was really frustrated about it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really, really, really bugs me is that everyone's on the cusp of making interesting choices. So kind of backpacking off of that idea of Clay won't tell his parents of, I'll tell you later, Mom. I just can't tell you right now. Is that, why isn't he telling him? Because it just seems like he's being a broody little, kid. But I'm interested. It's like, hey, she's involved in the case. If I give her these tapes or if I let her know, how is that going to complicate what's going on? And that's interesting to me. And I think this show has a lot of moments where it could be really interesting. I love the idea that Hannah did lie on the tapes. Like when he has that note that it's like, cool, like, you threw away the note, you're a jerk. And he's like, no, I didn't. I have it right here. Hannah lied on the tapes. And I think that's fascinating because you trust the narrator the whole way through, and then you stop. And I think if they pushed that could have been interesting, but instead it was just the one thing and everything else was true.
Right. Well, and for me, I sort of thought it was more a misunderstanding. She never becomes an actually unreliable narrator, right? She's always telling pretty much the truth in every situation. And early on, they push and pull with that idea, which is something that a lot of these other kind of crime dramas do a lot of the time, right? But with her, it's not anything different.
Well, and a part of Hannah's truthiness, right? Her ability, I was sort of on Jessica's side here because I thought it was a misunderstanding where thought she saw him throw it away and it wasn't really him throwing it away, and now she's dead. No one can correct the mistake or misunderstanding that was had, right? But part of the problem of me trusting her and trusting her narration of the events as they have purportedly happened is that I feel the show is deeply socially irresponsible with what it does, because the ways in which it's depicting her explanations of the not one but two rapes that happen over the course of the show, as well as the very graphic, gratuitous depiction of her suicide at the end, was really, really irresponsible. I mean, just from a basic human level, I don't want to say morals or ethics because those are complicated, but from a basic human decency level, I thought that it was really irresponsible how they did things.
Yeah. But does it have to be responsible?
And that's the $10,000 question. Right? Yeah. Does television of any kind, streaming, network, cable, whatever you want to call it, does it have any responsibility to the public it is selling itself towards to be responsible or to depict things responsibly, or should we just let it be what it is and judge it as so?
Well, I think regardless, I think the whole point, they come in here, like I said, Selena Gomez in any of the interviews she did talked about, we wanted to make sure we wanted this to be really graphic and not shy away from it because we don't want to glamorize suicide. We don't want to...
They totally failed.
Exactly. The thing is they spent probably 5 minutes, probably a 5-minute scene, not glamorizing it after 12 and a half episodes glamorizing it. Oh. They make this suicide it really is about attention. Like, hey, I'm going to send these tapes. I'm going to do this dramatic, grandiose gesture to make everyone realize what they did to me. Mm-hmm. And it glamorizes it. And people talk about one of the real fears is that there will be copycats in the real world.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, and they totally justify her behavior. She commits suicide at the end because really terrible stuff happened to her. Like that's the thread that they draw. It's like, no, it wasn't something she made up in her mind. It wasn't an actual state of depression, which is what normally causes suicide, but a series of events. Right? And that's not really how mental illness works.
Well, and that the show conflates teen angst and mental illness, right? There are very few, if any, conversations of her suffering from a mental illness or someone noticing she's suffering from a mental illness. Rather, we just see like bad teen stuff happening to her. And then she makes this huge decision, and like, suicide does not happen because bad stuff happens to you. Suicide happens because you are clinically depressed.
Right. Well, and that's one of my problems with the show is like, did anybody get super irritated about how passive-aggressive Hannah Baker is?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I was so angry half the time. There's that moment where she stands outside the hall and waits for Mr. Porter to come out. And she's like, he's not coming. And she's like, I guess I just have to do it. And it's like, if you want something, you have to articulate it. You know, it's the same thing when she punishes Clay, right? In this episode where she gets really upset with him while they're having like an amorous interaction. She flashes back to all this bad stuff that's happened to her. And she goes like, hey, leave me alone. And then she punishes him on the tapes because he actually did what she asked him to do with her voice.
He respected her consent.
And left.
Right. And he internalizes that as his fault. If I'd stayed, if I told her I loved her, then it would be different. It's like, no, it wouldn't.
Jessica's making very aggressive hand gestures.
So the other thing, and this really bothered me, is like, why on earth in 2017 are we having a white knight scenario here? Because essentially, the only person who gets closure in this whole show is Clay. The show is actually about Clay. It's not even about Hannah, right? And so we have this whole trajectory where we're having this situation where he comes in and gets he is the one who gets vengeance, not her. It's not her who gets vengeance. It's him. He does it on her behalf, and it's like, really? We're locked in a tower. We're doing this thing.
You're absolutely right. It's Mario. It's damsel in distress. It's all that, and it shouldn't be a story about revenge. It shouldn't. Fundamentally, it should be about grief. It should be about loss. It shouldn't be a mystery. It should be, hey, this person who was important to us, we lost. That sucks. This is what happens because of it. And she's selfish. She doesn't even leave her parents a note.
Well, and it comes right back to the social responsibility thing, because I don't know that we completely addressed that question. I mean, personally, I think if you're going to take upon yourself the mantle of depicting these horrifying things, rape, suicide, sexual assault, right, what should be mental illness but is not discussed as mental illness, I think you do have a certain amount of responsibility, specifically if you're dealing with minors. Okay, specifically if you're dealing with minors. These are minors. There's one character in the show who we learn towards the end is 18, but she's not for the whole show. So I think that that's where the crux comes in, is they're dealing with minors. And I feel like that increases their potential responsibility with this thing. And part of the reason why social media has had such an outcry over this show is because there seems to be this mythology surrounding the show, and I'm not 100% sure whether or not this was well researched. There's a Tumblr post, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen if you have any friends who are watching the show, that says that the creators of the show went to a particular town where they have a high rate of teen suicide and interviewed the kids who live in the town, the parents, counselors, school administrators, about how they should handle this particular topic. What should they do? What should they not do? What should they veer away from? What should they be striving for? And essentially took that advice and did all the stuff the people told them not to do. They did a complete 180. They showed the suicide in graphic detail. They showed the rapes in graphic detail. The show's very gratuitous, and it does glamorize and glorify almost the act of suicide that Hannah Baker takes. And so that's the problem that I'm having here, is because they made all the steps that they should have done to do this thing responsibly, and then made a decision to not be responsible. Right.
And they don't, I guess you could argue that they don't glamorize the act, but they in so many ways glamorize the context around it with the tapes. And no, I think either way you could talk about it, but for me, like glamorizing the tapes and the act around it and how she handles the suicide. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the memes, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't, go on Facebook, search 13 Reasons Why memes, where basically people will say, oh, you have offended me in some way. There's like, United Airlines, this is your tape. Or, even the thing we referred to at the beginning, like, this is your tape. That's become part of meme culture. And it's about a girl's suicide.
Yeah.
That's serious.
Yeah, and especially the decision they made with how to depict her suicide. My understanding, because this is based on a book, the 13 Reasons Why television show is based on a YA novel. And in the novel, my understanding is that she kills herself using pills. Her father in the show is a pharmacist. And so she has a sort of unrestricted access to these heavy-duty medications because she works in her parents' store occasionally. And so she has access to pills. She takes the pills, and that's how she kills herself. However, they changed it in the show so that she very graphically, and we will not talk about it in too much detail because we do not want to make the same missteps that the show made, but she slits her wrists. And I think that is that's a huge deviation from how the original book meant to handle it. And I, to this day, with the interviews that I have read, articles that I have read, which have been many, do not understand why they made that decision.
So, okay, I have a couple of thoughts about this because I think part of the problem is that, like, can you ever actually responsibly depict suicide? Because it's not a responsible act, right?
Yep.
Like, theoretically, that it's the opposite of that. So, in order to depict that thing happening, is there ever a responsible way to do that? And besides that, does this show have an obligation to do it? Because I really don't think it does. I mean, I think that I have to say that there were scenes in this particular show that were so shocking and horrifying to me that I spent like the next week and a half flashing back on them unexpectedly. I'd be sitting down on the couch and I would think about what I witnessed or what I saw, and I couldn't breathe. Like, there were moments where that actually physically, I think it's potentially the worst thing I've ever seen on television.
I'd agree.
The worst.
I had a physical reaction. I was sitting on my couch looking at my TV, and I physically was moving and shuddering. And I'm not squeamish. I can handle some grotesque stuff in media, but it was really unsettling. And I think, so I guess you could say it was effective. We thought about it. It's made an impact. And that's, I guess, successful. They wanted to make that impact, so they succeeded. And maybe I'm wrong in this opinion, but I also don't think that I didn't take suicide lightly before. It wasn't something that I was like, suicide. Oh, you've shown me this grotesque thing and now I take it seriously.
Well, it feels like in a lot of ways to me like a sort of generational overcorrection, if that makes sense. Like, there's a lot of anxiety in the show about, like, so she's using old tapes, right? Flipping them back and forth, the recording equipment, the way that they participate in the media itself is through these like analog devices, right? And it seems to me to be like, hey, this generation really suffers from a problem of personal responsibility. So if we go back to olden days where we all had tapes and all the kids were amazing and personally responsible, then we could all understand what's happening.
Suicide began with the millennial generation.
Oh my God.
So we're responsible for everything now, or at least we're so irresponsible that we're trying to overcorrect in these ways that are shocking, right? Because that's the moral of the story is be nice to other people and be personally responsible. Right? And so
but they never, I think one of the biggest problems that I have is that they never hold Hannah responsible for her own suicide, right? It's always, and you brought this up earlier, it's always, well, if they had done this, maybe I wouldn't have. Clay goes, well, maybe if I had come back, if I had made her talk to me, she would be alive today. Tony, right? Tony says, if I had just followed her that one night, she would be alive today. No, if someone is going to kill themselves, they will find a way to kill themselves because it is them doing it. Nobody makes you commit suicide.
Right. Well, and at one point, Tony says, we all killed Hannah Baker. And I think that that's a completely insane statement. It's just nuts. And what's crazy about it is, like, they even voice the opposing view through Mr. Porter, right? Mr. Porter goes like, hey, you can't stop this from happening. He actually articulates that sentiment. But the way that the music plays, the ways the hero of the story is Clay. And he's sitting on the other side of that dialogue. And so we just disregard Mr. Porter and, in fact, turn him into a kind of villain.
Well, I think personally, I went in there. I'll be completely honest. That episode was spoiled for me. I did know ahead of time that Mr. Porter was the 13th reason he was on the tapes and the way in which he was culpable. And the way it was presented was like he rejected Hannah. He didn't listen to her. He didn't give her the help that he was supposed to give her. I watched the episode and I said, bullshit. He absolutely was there. He's like, hey, what happened? Do we need to call the police? Do we need to involve your parents? Like, he made the effort. And yeah, he didn't go after her. And yeah, he's like, well, if you don't want to call the police, there's not a lot we can do about that. And maybe he didn't handle it in the absolute 100% best way, but he made the effort. And it was sort of made out to me that he didn't make the effort.
Right. Well, and they keep trying to play up this sort of, there's like job stresses happening for him, right? So he has a family that he's trying to support. And at one point he tears out the page in the journal that he keeps of the student records so that people don't know that he met with Hannah Baker on the day of her death, right? We see him taking these kinds of nefarious actions all the way through. But I felt really upset about the way that they ended up portraying him because I think the moral of the story from the perspective of the teenagers who are shouting their great song and theme about what we're supposed to learn from all of this completely disregard, some of the difficult realities that prevent us from being able to help the people that we actually want to help.
Well, and that purportedly this is getting a second season.
Yeah.
Because the way the show ends, spoiler alert, if you're not quite there yet, though, you've gotten way too many spoilers already if you're not at the end. Alex, one of the characters in the show, kills himself at the end of the show.
Shoots himself.
So he shoots himself. So we've got another suicide. Tyler, who's the cameraman who allegedly stalked Hannah, is stockpiling arms for what seems to be a school shooting in the making. And then Justin, one of our other characters, also has gotten a hold of his mom's methy boyfriend's gun. So we've got a lot of guns floating around, and we got a lot of really unstable teenagers, and it's all going to take us into a season 2 of the show that I don't know needs a season 2.
Is this supposed to be a metaphor? Like, I'm confused. How many tragic things can possibly happen in the space of like a week in high school?
It's a domino effect. I don't know. I'm just really afraid that season 2 is going to open with Tyler shooting everyone and sending his 13 tapes.
Right.
And it's going to be this...
I think it's going to be 13 CDs. I'm pretty sure. That's the next step, right? We have to go in
13
order.
USBs.
13 8-tracks.
8 tracks.
He's got to go
there
even further back.
Right.
So if you had to give this show a grade, what would you grade it?
F.
F.
F, 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 F. All the Fs it deserves.
I mean, if we talk about like production value, acting, what you talk about, like I think it gets a B in those terms. But in terms of overall dialogue, what the show's about, how they execute it, rage that it induced in my heart and soul, I definitely have to go with F.
Yeah, this is where I'm giving it a D-. And it's because I
just rolled my eyes.
Because I don't think that I can divorce the show's content from its production, at least in my own mind, because they're so integral to each other, especially in this context. And I do not want to take away the actors, what I believe were great performances from them because of how crappy the content was that they participated in. Because the cast is young, relatively unknown, and so I want to put credit where it's due, but if I did have to go with you guys and just go content versus production, content is an F, production is a B+.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. After this horrifying experience, did you guys actually watch anything good? What'd you watch this week?
Well, Brooklyn Nine-Nine came back. So I've been watching the new episodes of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. After the Good Place episode we did, talking about Michael Schur, I was like, I need to get me some Schur back in my life. So I've been rewatching all the seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which I remember when I first heard about it, I was like, I don't know if this is going to be a good show. It sounds kind of dumb, but I love Andy Samberg.
Yeah, me too. He's great.
And it's awesome.
Oh, by the way, this is Scott.
If you couldn't tell.
So if you couldn't tell, he just became a disembodied voice, much like Hannah Baker.
Live and in stereo.
This is your tape, Jessica.
So Scott's on the team. And yeah, Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi. So as Jessica said twice, my name's Scott. I have a background mostly in theater, acting, directing, and writing, but also a little bit of film when I went to school for Jess and I know each other from school. I currently work for Netflix, actually, their customer service department and their technical research. This in no way makes me a representative of them. I do not speak for the company in any way, shape, or form. Addressed to my HR department. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Well, we're glad to have you here. So I watched some bubblegum after this terrible nightmare of television. I watched Jane the Virgin. I caught up on Jane the Virgin. And I love Jane the Virgin. It's a telenovela, but it's also making fun of itself the whole time. The characters in it are great. And it's a beautiful story about 3 women. And I love that show. So that's what I've been watching this week.
I've been watching Rick and Morty.
Oh, man.
I love Rick and Morty so much, guys. I love it so much. And I know, so Rick and Morty gives Jessica existential crises because the whole show is about how unimportant everybody is in the context of the galaxy. And I absolutely cannot get enough of that stuff.
Rick and Morty's the best.
And so I've been
favorites.
watching, so they dropped the season 3 premiere on April Fools, which I thought was the most Rick and Morty thing that anyone could have done ever. And I finally watched it because Scott sent me a YouTube link because he's a champion. And I absolutely love this show, and the humor in it is just top notch. And every time I watch it, I know exactly what's going to happen, and it's entertaining every time. And there's a quote from one of these episodes that is just so, it encapsulates like my philosophy, and it will let you know who I am as a person. That quote is, "Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs out anywhere. Everybody's going to die. Come watch TV."
Rick and Morty. Dan Harmon is God. Community. Rick and Morty. Amazing. They're making a Rick and Morty VR game.
So excited. It's going to be awesome.
Thanks for joining us at this week on UniversiTV. We're sorry we had to put you through this review of 13 Reasons Why. I'm Jessica Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen.
And this was UniversiTV. Make sure to check us out on Facebook or Twitter by liking us at UniversiTV Podcast, or you can email us at universitytvpodcast@gmail.com with your recommendations for future episodes.